Welcome to Silent Graveyard Whisperer, where we dive into the darkest corners of the unknown, unraveling stories that will haunt your mind long after the screen goes dark. If you love tales of suspense, twisted mysteries, and spine-chilling horror, then you've come to the right place. Grab a seat, turn down the lights, prepare yourself for a journey like no other, because once you step into our world, there's no turning back. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on the next terrifying story we have in store for you. Jacob steps into the cold, silent skyscraper lobby at 11:47 p.m. The empty elevator dings, its air unnaturally frigid. As it ascends, the display glitches 10, 15, 13, then stops at 47. The doors open to a decayed hallway reeking of earth and iron. Pale, jerky figures in old-era clothing turn toward him. A child tilts her head unnaturally. The doors slam shut. Trapped, Jacob stumbles as whispers rise. "You shouldn't have come here." The screen cuts to black. The elevator of the dead fades in over a deep, growing hum. The sharp click of polished shoes echoed through the empty, dimly lit office lobby as Jacob Mayer walked in. The lobby seemed impossibly large in the absence of life, its sterile design suddenly more menacing than modern. The cold marble floors, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the faint glow of fluorescent lights overhead. For a Thursday night, the building was unusually silent, eerily so. He adjusted his tie and glanced at the clock behind the reception desk. 11:47 p.m. It was late, even by his standards, but the deal he had been working on for months demanded his attention. He had always prided himself on his discipline, on being the last one in the office, the one willing to do what others wouldn't. Tonight, though, there was a gnawing discomfort in his chest, a vague unease he couldn't quite shake. He pressed the button for the elevator and waited, the soft hum of the machinery faintly audible above the oppressive silence. The polished metal doors reflected his sharp suit, his neatly combed hair, and his drawn expression. His image felt oddly distorted, as if the reflection wasn't entirely his own. The elevator dinged, the sound unnaturally sharp, and the doors slid open to reveal the empty car. Jacob stepped in without hesitation, though the air inside felt colder than the lobby. He shifted his leather briefcase to his other hand, his fingers tightening on the handle. The space was uncomfortably quiet, save for the faint buzz of the overhead lights. He jabbed the button for the 47th floor, and the doors closed with a soft hiss. As the elevator began its ascent, Jacob leaned against the mirrored wall, exhaling a tired breath. He watched the floor numbers on the digital display climb steadily, 2, 3, 4, and felt the faint vibration beneath his feet. At first, everything seemed normal, but then the numbers began to behave strangely. They skipped and flickered, jumping erratically, 10, 15, 13. Jacob straightened, frowning at the display. The hum of the elevator grew louder, almost imperceptibly at first, but then it began to sound more like a groan, low and guttural, as if the machinery were straining against an unseen weight. The lights flickered. Jacob tensed, his hand instinctively gripping the rail beside him. The fluorescent bulbs overhead pulsed once, then twice, plunging the small space into brief moments of darkness. When the light stabilized, he noticed his reflection in the mirrored walls. It was wrong. The angles of his face were stretched unnaturally, his shadow elongating and twisting across the mirrored panels in ways that defied logic. His chest tightened as he turned to look directly at the reflection, but it shifted back to normal as soon as his eyes met it. The numbers above the door slowed. 41, 43, 44. The elevator shuddered to a stop. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the doors slid open with a soft chime. He stepped out and froze. The floor wasn't his office. The air was damp and cold, carrying the unmistakable scent of wet earth and iron. The lights in the hallway were dim, flickering faintly like dying candles. Shadows clung to the corners of the space, shifting and twisting with the rhythm of the faltering lights. The walls, once sleek and modern, were now stained and cracked, as if the building had aged 100 years in an instant. Rows of figures stood in the corridor ahead, their backs turned to him. There were dozens of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in rigid, unnatural postures. Their clothes were anachronistic, a strange mix of eras and styles. A man in a three-piece suit from the 1940s stood beside a woman in a faded 1980s power suit, her shoulder pads drooping. A child in a tattered, turn-of-the-century sailor's outfit clutched a worn teddy bear in one hand, its head dangling by a thread. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to retreat into the elevator, but his feet refused to move. The figures were utterly still, their silhouettes unnerving in their lack of motion. He took a hesitant step forward, his breath shallow and rapid. The sound of the elevator doors sliding shut behind him made him spin around, but it was too late. The sleek metal doors were gone, replaced by a solid, featureless wall. Jacob pressed his palms flat against the surface, his fingers scraping for a seam or a button, but there was nothing. The air seemed to grow heavier, the silence almost deafening. When he turned back, the figures had begun to move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they turned to face him. Their movements were stiff and jerky, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. As their faces came into view, Jacob's stomach lurched. Their skin was pale and waxy, their eyes sunken and clouded. Some had mouths that hung open in silent screams, while others bore expressions of vacant despair. The child with the teddy bear was the first to step forward, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she took a single, unsteady step toward him. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words Jacob couldn't hear. The others began to follow, their footsteps uneven but deliberate, the sound of their shuffling growing louder in the oppressive silence. Jacob stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but his voice caught in his throat. The figures closed in, their lifeless eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He turned and ran. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, the walls closing in as he sprinted. His footsteps echoed in the confined space, blending with the sound of the shuffling figures behind him. No matter how far he ran, the hallway never seemed to end. The air grew colder with each step, his breath forming faint clouds in the dim light. A faint sound reached his ears, a low hum, deep and resonant, vibrating in his chest like the growl of some enormous, unseen creature. It grew louder as he ran, drowning out the sound of his own breathing. And then the floor beneath him gave way. Jacob fell into darkness, his briefcase slipping from his grasp as he plummeted. The sensation was disorienting, the air rushing past him as he tumbled through the void. Just as suddenly as the fall had begun, it ended. He landed with a jarring thud, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. The ground beneath him was cold and damp, the smell of earth and decay overwhelming. He pushed himself to his feet, his hands trembling as he scanned his surroundings. He was in a cavernous space, its walls lined with jagged, uneven stones. The only light came from a faint, flickering glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The figures were there too, but they were no longer shuffling. They stood in a wide circle around him, their lifeless eyes fixed on him with unrelenting intensity. In the center of the circle stood a single figure, taller than the others, draped in a tattered cloak that seemed to writhe and shift like smoke. Its face was obscured, but its presence was suffocating, its very existence radiating a malevolence that made Jacob's knees buckle. The figure raised an arm, and the hum in the air grew deafening. Jacob clutched his head, his vision blurring as the sound pressed against his skull. Images flashed through his mind, moments from his life, decisions he had made, faces he had forgotten. He saw himself shaking hands with business partners, signing contracts, making deals that had ruined lives. The weight of his choices crashed down on him, an unbearable tide of guilt and regret. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. Jacob's knees gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, his body trembling. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the hum stopped. Jacob opened his eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures were gone. The cavern was gone. He was back in the elevator, the hum of the machinery steady and familiar. The floor numbers ticked upward, 45, 46, 47. When the doors slid open, the bright lights of his office greeted him. The air was crisp and clean, the smell of damp earth and iron replaced by the faint scent of coffee and paper. Jacob stumbled out, his briefcase still in hand, his mind reeling. But as he stepped into the office, he froze. The rows of desks were empty, the windows dark. The air was too still, too silent. And then he saw them. The figures were there, standing at the far end of the office, their lifeless eyes fixed on him. They were waiting. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the figures standing at the far end of the office floor. They hadn't moved, but their presence was suffocating. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting shifting shadows across the space. The office, so familiar by day, had become a warped version of itself, stretching into something alien. The rows of desks seemed to extend endlessly in every direction. The faint hum of computers, the rustle of paper, the murmured voices of co-workers. Everything he was used to was gone. The air was heavy, thick with the same metallic tang he had smelled earlier. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned toward the elevator behind him. It was gone. The doors had vanished, replaced by an unbroken expanse of wall. Panic surged through him as he pressed his palms against the cold surface, his fingers scrambling for a seam or a crack. But there was nothing. When he turned back, the figures were closer. They moved silently, their feet not quite touching the ground, their limbs stiff and unnatural. Their lifeless eyes bore into him, unblinking and unwavering. Jacob stumbled backward, knocking into a desk, sending papers scattering to the floor. "Stay away," he croaked, his voice breaking. But the figures didn't stop. He turned and ran, weaving between the rows of desks, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. His polished shoes squeaked against the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel them, feel their cold, lifeless gazes boring into his back. The office floor seemed to stretch endlessly, the usual landmarks, meeting rooms, break areas, nowhere to be found. No matter how far he ran, the desks kept repeating, row after row after row. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't stop. Then he heard it, a sound, low and guttural, like a growl reverberating through the air. It wasn't coming from the figures. It was deeper, more primal, vibrating through the very floor beneath his feet. Jacob skidded to a stop, his chest heaving. The ground beneath him trembled. He stumbled, grabbing onto the edge of a desk for support. The lights above flickered violently, plunging the room into strobing chaos. Shadows twisted and danced across the walls, elongating into monstrous shapes that seemed to reach for him. A loud crack split the air, and Jacob turned just in time to see the floor behind him begin to collapse. The polished tiles crumbled away into darkness, the edges of the hole jagged and uneven. The figures stood at the edge, motionless, as the void consumed the space around them. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to move, and he bolted, the floor disintegrating beneath his feet. The sound of cracking tiles and splintering would follow him as the void chased him, growing larger with every passing second. He sprinted toward the far end of the office, his mind racing. There had to be an exit, an emergency staircase, a fire escape, something. But the walls ahead were smooth and featureless, offering no way out. The growling sound grew louder, deeper, as though the void itself was alive, hungry. The air was cold now, icy, each breath burning in his chest. Then he saw it, a door. It was small, unassuming, set into the wall at the far corner of the office. It shouldn't have been there. It wasn't part of the building's layout, but Jacob didn't care. It was his only chance. He lunged for the door, grabbing the handle and yanking it open. The void was right behind him, the growl deafening, the air pulling at him like a vacuum. Without a second thought, he threw himself through the doorway and slammed it shut behind him. Silence. Jacob collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The air here was still cold, but it lacked the suffocating weight of the office. He sat up slowly, his hands trembling as he took in his surroundings. He was in a stairwell, but it wasn't the stairwell from his building. The walls were rough stone, damp and moss-covered, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. A single, flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting dim light on the winding staircase that stretched endlessly upward and downward. Jacob hesitated, his mind racing. Up or down? Neither option felt safe, but he knew he couldn't stay here. The growl was gone, but he could feel the void pressing against the door behind him, waiting. He chose up. His legs ached as he climbed, each step heavier than the last. The staircase seemed to go on forever, spiraling upward without end. The walls closed in as he ascended, the space growing narrower, the air thinner. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, carried on the stale air. It was coming from above, growing louder with each step he took. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was pleading, desperate. Jacob's breath quickened, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it someone else? Another victim trapped in this nightmare? Or was it another trick, another trap waiting to ensnare him? He hesitated, his foot hovering over the next step. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic now, echoing off the stone walls. Against his better judgment, he continued upward. Jacob's pulse thundered in his ears as the whispers became louder, growing frantic, almost pleading. His hand gripped the stone railing as he ascended, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air around him was suffocating, and the stifling scent of mildew and decay clung to his clothes like a second skin. He didn't know how much longer he could keep climbing, but the pull toward the sound, the whispering, desperate voice, was too strong to ignore. Each step was like a hammer against his chest, his legs burning, his breath coming in short gasps. The stairwell was narrow now, its walls pressing in on him, the flickering light above growing dimmer, as if being slowly extinguished by an unseen force. The air was thick with the promise of something that waited for him at the top. With a final, gritted breath, Jacob reached the top of the stairs. He slammed through a rusted door, and the darkness beyond swallowed him whole. The room beyond was small, cramped, too small. Jacob stepped inside, his heart thundering as he took in his surroundings. It was a circular chamber, stone walls covered in grime, and a floor slick with moisture. The air was stifling, the very atmosphere pressing against him with a weight that threatened to crush him. A single, dim light hung from the ceiling above, its bulb flickering in the same erratic pattern he had come to expect. But there was something else in the air, something darker. And then he saw it. In the center of the room stood a figure, a man, or what had once been a man. His body was gaunt, skeletal, and draped in tattered, rotting clothing. The figure stood motionless at the center, his hollow eyes fixed on Jacob, unblinking, unwavering. He had a gaping mouth, open and lined with decay, but no sound came from it. His very presence radiated malevolence, suffocating the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers had stopped. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the figure's head tilted slightly to the side. It was then that he saw the truth. The figure wasn't alone. Around the room, on the edges of the stone walls, were more figures, more bodies, standing or slumped in unnatural positions. They were not mannequins, nor were they mere specters. They were the dead, the same haunting figures Jacob had seen in the office building. There were dozens of them now, dozens of hollow-eyed, lifeless corpses, each one seemingly waiting for something. He realized, with a sickening twist in his stomach, that they weren't just waiting, they were waiting for him. The air grew colder. His breath fogged in front of him as he took a shaky step backward, the shadows closing in on him, surrounding him. His mind raced. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't face these things. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, but the walls seemed to close in, and the door he had come through vanished. He was trapped. Suddenly, the floor beneath him groaned, a low, ominous sound that reverberated through his bones. Jacob's eyes widened in terror as the ground shifted, the very stone beneath his feet beginning to crack and split open. He could hear it now, the sound of something moving beneath the floor, something ancient and powerful clawing its way toward him. The ground split wider, revealing a dark chasm that seemed to extend into nothingness. The dead began to stir. At first, it was subtle. One of them twitched, the arm lifting slightly, then lowering again. Another jerked as if waking from a deep slumber. And then, in a sickening chorus, they all began to move. Their limbs, stiff and slow at first, grew quicker, jerking unnaturally. Their faces turned toward him, their hollow eyes locking onto his every movement. There was no sound except for the sickening crack of joints, the rustling of decomposing flesh. Jacob stepped back, his feet slipping on the slick stone. His breath caught in his throat as a cold hand gripped his arm from behind. He whirled around to face a child, her face pale with hollow, staring eyes. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her bony fingers tightening around his wrist. The figures surged toward him, the room filled with the shuffling of dead feet, the rasp of decaying lungs struggling for breath, the sickening crack of bones shifting beneath flesh. Jacob's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees, his mind racing, his heart pounding, his body frozen in terror. The figure in the center of the room, the leader, raised its arm. Its eyes locked with Jacob's, and in that moment, everything went still. The dead stopped moving. The room, once filled with the sounds of the living dead, became deathly silent. Jacob's breathing was the only sound that dared break the stillness. A cold, rasping voice echoed in his mind, one that seemed to come from everywhere at once, one that was not spoken but felt. "You should never have come here." The words reverberated in his mind like a death knell. He tried to move, to flee, but his body refused to obey. His legs trembled as if weighed down by the sheer force of the dead's collective gaze. He could feel the weight of their hunger, the crushing inevitability of their presence. And then something shifted. The figure in the center of the room moved. It stepped forward, its limbs creaking, dragging its decomposing body toward Jacob. The figure's hollow eyes narrowed, its mouth opening, its rotting lips parting to reveal a gaping maw of teeth that were too sharp and too many. Jacob's throat constricted as the figure reached down, its hand hovering above him, its fingers twitching. It reached for his face, the coldness of its touch radiating outward, sending a tremor through his entire being. His eyes widened as its bony fingers brushed against his cheek, leaving behind a chilling, deathly mark that seemed to burn into his skin. The air around him crackled with the energy of something ancient, something evil. The very fabric of reality around him seemed to bend and twist. The figures, all of them, were watching, waiting for him to make the final choice. In that moment, Jacob understood. The elevator, the corridor, the room full of the dead, it wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a trap built to snare those who had crossed a threshold they shouldn't have. Those who had lived without consequence. Those who had taken the lives of others, whether knowingly or not. And now, he was the one who was trapped. The figure in front of him leaned down further, its cold breath seeping into his skin, its eyes filled with an unholy knowledge. The dead were waiting, not for his escape, but for his acceptance. As Jacob's breath caught in his throat, he realized with chilling certainty that there was no escape from the elevator of the dead. The real horror wasn't the figures, it was the truth of their existence, their endless waiting. The truth was that he was one of them now. The last thing Jacob felt before the world slipped away was the sensation of cold hands wrapping around his throat. Jacob's mind screamed for him to move, but his body was paralyzed, frozen in a web of fear. His thoughts were fragmented, disconnected. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The figure's cold fingers pressed into his skin, its grip tightening with the slow certainty of death. His body felt numb, as though the room itself had drained the very life from him, rendering him a hollow shell. But even as his mind screamed in terror, something else deep within him stirred. It wasn't just panic, it was recognition, understanding. The room, the elevator, the figures, this wasn't a random nightmare. It wasn't some cruel trick of fate. No, this place, this moment, was the culmination of every moment in his life that he had ignored, every choice he had made without thought or care, every face he had turned away from. every slight he had given without remorse. And that was the true terror. This wasn't some supernatural punishment. This was the reckoning for his life. The lives he had trampled on, the ones he had discarded, all led him to this very place. The dead weren't waiting for him by accident. As the figure leaned closer, its foul breath like ice on his skin, Jacob realized that this was his final trial. There was no escape from it, no clever trick, no heroic escape. He couldn't outrun this. He had lived in the shadows of his own actions for so long that he had never seen this darkness coming. But now it had him, wrapping around him like a vice. And there was no one to save him. The memories began to surface in waves. Faces, names. His father, whom he had abandoned years ago, dying in a nursing home, alone, with no visitors. His business partners, those he had betrayed for personal gain, twisting the knife in their backs. The people he had fired, discarded without a second thought, treating them as though they were nothing but tools in his rise to power. Each of them had become a part of the room around him, part of the figures. The men and women whose faces he never bothered to remember had become part of the very fabric of this nightmare, each one waiting for him now, their empty eyes accusing him of his sins. And that was the worst part. Jacob knew it was his own guilt that had brought him here. His own sense of entitlement, his belief that he could move through life untouched while others suffered. The dead had no compassion, no mercy, and neither would the universe that had thrown him into this place. The floor beneath him seemed to vibrate as the figure before him leaned in even closer, its decaying face inches from his own. The coldness of its presence seeped into him, dragging him downward. But just before the figure could touch him, Jacob's vision blurred. His mind fractured, breaking apart like glass. He heard the voices again, the voices of the dead, but now they weren't just whispers. They were louder, more persistent. You left us, all of us. It wasn't one voice. It was many. The voices of the forgotten, the ignored, the abandoned. They were everywhere, surrounding him, pressing into his skin, his mind. He could feel their pain, their anger, their resentment. It wasn't a voice in the air. It was in his head, in his very bones. It was the voices of all the people he had failed. The figure finally spoke, but the words were not its own. The voice echoed within his mind, hollow and cavernous, rising from the depths of his soul. What are you now? The question was simple, and yet, in that moment, Jacob understood its weight. What had he become? A man who had built his life on the backs of others. A man who had lived a life of privilege at the cost of countless others. And now, as the walls of the room tightened around him, as the dead closed in, he realized the horror wasn't the fact that he was trapped. It was the recognition that he had been living his whole life in a prison of his own making. The figures now surrounded him completely, a sea of lifeless bodies, their eyes boring into him. Their faces were distorted with rotting flesh, their bodies twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. They were not monsters. They were the people he had discarded, the ones he had wronged. He was no longer a man. He was no longer Jacob, the businessman who had risen to the top. He had become just another lost soul among the dead, another face among the forgotten, a part of a collection of countless others who had been consumed by their own choices. The cold hand released its grip from his throat, but he didn't feel free. The pressure remained, weighing him down. The hand had not left his body. It had become part of him. The room began to close in, the air thick with the stench of rot. He was suffocating. He was dying. But it was not the end of his physical body that filled him with dread. It was the emptiness that stretched out before him, the eternity of unfulfilled lives, the knowledge that there was no escape from this, no escape from the void he had created with every decision, every indifferent action. Jacob wanted to scream, but his voice was lost. The figures drew closer, their hollow eyes now seeming to see straight into his soul. Their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It wasn't the grotesque appearance of the dead that was the true horror. It was their quiet, relentless judgment, their endless, accusing gaze. And in that moment, Jacob realized he wasn't just facing death, he was facing his own moral death. The world around him faded to black, and for the first time, Jacob felt the true weight of his life. He had never truly lived at all. The silence was deafening, a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed down on Jacob's chest as the figures loomed over him. His body was paralyzed, a puppet at the mercy of their judgment. The realization of what he had become, the weight of his sins, the faces of the dead whose lives he had disregarded, hung over him like a dark cloud. There was no escape. There was no redemption. His soul had been consumed, swallowed whole by his own choices, and now he was just another lost soul among the dead. The room was closing in around him. The shadows of the figures stretched longer, and their hollow eyes glared down at him with such intensity that it felt as though they were digging into his very soul. Their cold fingers reached for him once more, not to touch, but to claim him, to drag him into the eternal darkness. But just as their hands hovered over him, the ground beneath Jacob shifted. The stone floor trembled, and the room suddenly felt unstable, like it was no longer bound by the laws of reality. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. Something was happening. Something was wrong. The air around him crackled with an energy he couldn't understand, the oppressive silence broken by a low hum, like the beginning of a storm. The figures began to move erratically now, their movements no longer synchronized, as though they were struggling to maintain their form. The room itself seemed to waver, like a mirage on the verge of collapse. Then, everything stopped. The stillness was unnatural, terrifying in its absolute calm. The figures stood motionless, their eyes still locked on Jacob, but now their presence felt hollow, empty, like puppets without strings. Jacob stood frozen, his mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. The energy in the room was palpable. Something was shifting. Something was about to break. And then it happened. The ground cracked open beneath his feet, and the figures began to fade, dissolving into the darkness around them. Their bodies crumbled away like ash in the wind. The air thickened, swirling with darkness and light, until Jacob could no longer tell which was which. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. Jacob found himself standing alone, at the center of the room, the oppressive silence once again settling in. The coldness had vanished, replaced by an eerie warmth, but the sense of dread remained. He was still in the same place, still trapped within the walls of the room, but something had changed. The figures were gone. The floor had stopped trembling. Jacob's chest heaved as he took in his surroundings, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The figures, the crushing weight of their presence, the horrifying realization of his own guilt, it was all gone. But was it really? His hands shook as he glanced around, looking for any signs of movement. But there was nothing, only the dim light that hung above him, flickering like a distant memory. He turned around, desperate to find an exit. But the room, the stairwell, it was gone. There was no escape. For a moment, Jacob stood still, his body trembling with fear. He had no idea how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? Days? The walls around him seemed to stretch endlessly, and the air felt thick, suffocating. But then he heard something. A faint whisper, distant at first, then growing louder. The voice, no voices, were calling to him, familiar but twisted. The voice of his father. The voice of his business partners. The voices of the people he had wronged. But now there was a new voice among them, one he didn't recognize. It was his own. "You left us." The voices repeated, the words chilling, accusing. Jacob clutched his head, his mind spiraling as the voices grew louder, more insistent. He screamed, his hands pressed to his ears, but it didn't help. The voices filled his head, drowning out everything else. And then in the center of it all, he saw it. A shadow, a figure just like the others. But this time, it wasn't like the others. This figure was familiar. Too familiar. It was him. The figure stepped out of the darkness, its face the same as Jacob's, but twisted, decayed, the skin rotting away like an overripe fruit. Its eyes were hollow, empty, but they saw him, saw through him. It smiled, the corners of its lips stretching into a grotesque grin. Jacob stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure was him. It was his face, but worse. It was what he had become, the reflection of every wrong he had committed, every person he had failed, every life he had ruined. The figure raised a hand, and Jacob felt an icy grip tighten around his chest, constricting, squeezing the air from his lungs. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as the figure stepped closer, its grin widening. "You are one of us now." Jacob's vision blurred as the world around him began to fade, the figure's grin the last thing he saw. And as he fell into the darkness, a final realization washed over him. The elevator, the stairwell, the figures, they had all been tricks. A game, a test, a reflection of his own soul, fractured by his guilt, by his choices. And the true horror? Jacob had never left. He had never truly escaped. He had been dead all along. The twist, the horror, was that the moment he stepped onto that elevator, he had already sealed his fate. The dead weren't waiting for him, they were waiting for themselves. Jacob hadn't walked into their world. He had walked into his own. And now, there was no escape from the cycle. There was only the endless, eternal waiting. The room fell silent once more. The voices, the whispers of the past, the haunting specters of guilt and forgotten faces, they all faded into the darkness, leaving only the faintest echo of their presence, like a distant nightmare that clings to the edges of consciousness. Jacob had never truly left that elevator. He had never stepped out of the darkness that had been with him all along. The dead were not strangers, nor victims of some twisted fate. They were the remnants of his own choices, the ghosts of his own making. And as the shadows closed in around him, he understood the chilling truth. There is no escape from the past. It doesn't matter how far you run, how many floors you climb, or how much you try to outrun your own reflection. Eventually, the dead come for you, not because of anything they've done, but because of what you've done to them. And in the end, the most terrifying truth was this: the elevator wasn't a place. It was a mirror. Jacob was now one of them, the lost, the forgotten. And as the darkness swallowed him whole, his last thought, just before everything disappeared into the void, was a simple one. The dead are never truly gone. They are always waiting for you to become one of them. And so, the story ends, not with a scream, but with an unshakable silence, a reflection of the horror that lingers long after the elevator doors close. Who among us will be next?